and have a wonderful time.
Great. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Jane. First of all, can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay, I'm going to continue then. I'm thrilled to be discussing spirits and barrels with you in this webinar. I'm in New York right now. It's about 8 p.m. and it is a fairly chilly evening here. So you can bet that after I talk to you about barrels and spirits for the next several moments, I have a bourbon waiting for me. And I encourage all of you to do the same after the webinar. So let's get to the life of a spirits barrel. Barrels might not sound like the most glamorous thing, and they are a bit ignored. In some ways, they're the least understood part of making spirits. But I actually think that they're the most exciting part of making spirits. They're a bit of magic. They have no glue, no nails, but they hold itself together and they can hold spirits indefinitely. So when you had all of these early distillers learning that our hardwood forests could become a container for stuff, they actually eventually transformed the world of spirits forever. And that's because a barrel is more than just a container. A barrel is actually an ingredient, and it has a life of its own, which we'll discuss in this webinar. So I'm going to start off with this quote. When I first brainstormed this webinar, this Dr. Seuss quote popped into my head. It's from the book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, which is, in my family, a very common high school and college graduation gift. But I think it actually pertains to spirits barrels. More than ever, barrels are living big lives. They have a really long and storied past. Historically, they've traveled the world from country to country. And today, in this modern industry, they're being repurposed for really interesting projects, which is giving barrels multiple lives more than ever. So, to start with everything, let's go to the beginning. Before barrels. So prior to barrels, spirits, wine, all other stuff were transported in a number of items, but mostly clay jugs called amphora. And there were many issues with amphora, as you can imagine. They were very brittle, they broke very easily. So we knew we needed a better container. Along came the wood barrel. Now, you probably want to know who invented the barrel, but the problem is it's a little difficult to say because wooden artifacts don't really survive well, and you can't successfully do archaeology around them in the way you can do with other materials. So we can only guess as to who originally invented the barrels. But we do know that they get their first written mention in the 5th century BC. A Greek historian wrote of transporting wine barrels to Babylonia. So we heard it at that point. Historians and spirits also looked at Celtic tribes in Europe as potential candidates for inventors. And then you also can't discount the Roman influence. Our word cooper derives from the Latin word cupa, which means cask or barrel. So regardless of who invented it, and there could have been a number of groups, barrels ultimately would revolutionize the world of alcohol. They quickly became the king of packages. They were quite an improvement over the amphora. Wooden staves were highly shock absorbent, they were bendable. You were able to create this rotund shape, which allowed barrels to be stacked on each other in a boat or elsewhere and allowed them to be rolled. Also, one person could maneuver a several 100-pound barrel, so they were much more easily managed. And for 2,000 years, barrels truly were the king of packages. They were the best containers for both storage and for shipping. But this is where the webinar is concerned, not so much with their functionality, but with something else they did. The important part of barrels is that people discovered they had an unexpected benefit. And that is that barrels add flavor and dimension to whatever liquid is in them. And this ultimately opened up a whole new world of possibilities for alcohol in general. Barrels soon became synonymous with European spirits, and we could look at a number of countries, but I just want to look at Scotland as sort of a model to how this evolved. The first written record of whiskey making in Scotland goes to 1494, but we know that Scots were likely making whiskey before that written record, even. Initially, likely barrels were seen more as a transportation vessel and a storage vessel, as I just discussed. I read in preparing for this really funny historical accounts of barrels that were previously used for fish, that were repurposed for Scotch whiskey. And it's like, oh, can you imagine what some of these early uses of barrels might have tasted like? So we've come a long way. Eventually, though, barrels were seen as a flavor and a maturing mechanism. In the 1800s, we start seeing accounts of Scots referencing mature whiskey and enjoying mature whiskey. And this point, this is where barrels really get locomoting around Europe. Initially, the Scots were using Scottish and English oak to make barrels. But these trees took a really long time to grow. They could take up to 70 years to mature. It is an ingredient. The raw materials of spirits, and there are more than these three, but to put it very simply, water, and then you have grains or some other base ingredient, and barrels. It's believed that between 60 to 80% of the characteristics of barrel aged spirits come from the barrel itself. Um, to prepare for this webinar, I reached out to a number of distillers that I've met over the years, most of them here in the New York area and some throughout the country who make the products that we sell in the store. And I asked them about this. The first thing I asked them is, why did they decide to make barrel aged spirits as opposed to clear spirits? So this quote is from Matt Froman. He is part of the team at Taconic Distillery, and they're located in upstate New York. They've been doing really interesting things with barrels, and I'll tell you about that when we get to some of these cool products that are coming out on the market later. But he speaks to the distillery's expression. He says that bourbon and rye get their personality from aging. And aging is a magical process with many variables and chemistry still not fully understood. And with patience comes a product that is truly a product of the distillery's terroir. So he's speaking to what the distillery can express. Another distiller I spoke is Dan Garrison. He's really, really charming man and doing wonderful things. He's the owner and distiller of Garrison Brothers, and they're in Texas. It is the first and oldest legal whiskey distillery in Texas after Prohibition. He doesn't really see the opportunity for his creativity in clear spirits. As you see here, he says, vodka, by definition, must be flavorless and tasteless. It is simply distilled at the highest proof possible to remove all the flavor. And when I asked him what barrels give him then, he said, artistry. So I don't want to knock clear spirits. I certainly enjoy a number of clear spirits. But he finds an artistry on the part of the distiller that you can have with barrels as opposed to unaged and unbarreled spirits. So, what is so exciting that's going on inside of a barrel? Let's take a peek. Let's go inside the barrel. Barrels are a part of the entire spirits making process. Now, this little graphic says whiskey making, but I'm really referring to all spirits here. After distillation, all newly spirits are colorless and have a more neutral quality to them, regardless of the base ingredients used. We call these newly distilled spirits new make. The new make spirit, at this point after distillation, is placed in a barrel to go through what we call aging and maturation. And that is where this magic begins to happen. So in this slide, we kind of pull open the top of a barrel and we can look inside and see what's really, really happening. First of all, the chemistry involved in the maturation of spirits is quite complicated, but I want to start with one simple fact here. The life of a barrel starts with an oak tree. is on the left side there, extraction. This is when the alcohol itself soaks into the oak staves and when it pulls back out, it extracts all these flavors and compounds from the wood itself. Then on the top, we have evaporation. Now, we've all heard of the phrase angel share, and angel share speaks to evaporative loss. It's estimated that between 3% and 10% of liquid is lost annually. And somehow that loss, though a probably financial issue for many people, is lovingly called the angel share. Then we have oxidation right there on the right. And that's where oxygen enters the barrel through the porous oak. As oxygen dissolves into the spirit, new chemical interactions and new compounds are formed. And this is just like wine that we know changes and evolves over time with oxygen. Then we have on the bottom left there, filtration. Now, most barrels have charred interior surfaces. I didn't want to get too deeply into charring in this webinar because we could go into a very long road with that. But most of them are charred, and this surface acts like a charcoal filter. It absorbs a lot of unsavory compounds like sulfur, which is ultimately beneficial for the spirit and makes the spirit a more appealing palate experience. Then on the bottom right there, we have coloration. Now, we get the color of spirit that we know and we love, those beautiful light brown pale browns to those rich caramely colors. We get those from two different mechanisms mostly. First, that charred surface again has something called a red layer, and that introduces a burnt reddish color to the spirit. Second, oxidation also darkens the color. So we think of slicing an apple and leaving it out on the counter and how it turns brown. That same darkening, that coloration, is taking place because of oxygen inside the barrel to the spirit. Now, the last thing that we see is in the center there, concentration. As all this stuff is happening, evaporation and extraction and filtration, all of these compounds and flavors are becoming concentrated. It's very similar to reducing down a sauce on the stove. You reduce it down until it gets nice and rich and thick and your flavor profiles are stronger. The same thing's happening right inside here. So now all of this is happening simultaneously. It's like a computer running a lot of programs at the same time. It's all happening simultaneously over days, weeks, months, and years. And all of this pretty much happens on autopilot. But there are a lot of choices that a distiller can make that will influence some of these processes. So let's look at those choices. So there are many factors that exist here, many options a distiller can take, more than the few that we're going to discuss. But all of these will affect the final spirit, and the distiller has to make choices along the way and has to also balance out all of these factors that I'll discuss. A very important factor is barrel size. We see several here. I did ask a few distillers about this, about their experiences with barrel size. So on the top there, we see some thoughts from Steve D'Angelo, and he's the owner and distiller of Green Hook Gin Smiths, which is in Brooklyn, which has become a hotspot for distillation. Now, gins are typically clear, but Green Hook is producing the traditional Old Tom style of gin. I'm not sure if anybody's had this style, but I highly recommend it. And it is a barrel-aged gin, so he works with barrels quite a bit. Now, he said that over time, he's learned that small barrels create more oak to spirit contact. But he thinks that small barrels create too much contact, and in the case of gin, it covers up the complexity of the gin. So Steve, over time, has ultimately gone in the direction of larger barrels for less first distillery in the state after Prohibition was repealed. He told me that he's done a lot of experimentation over the years, and particularly on their baby bourbon. Um, and he noticed that smaller barrels produce whiskey in a much shorter time and with a vanilla note. And he acknowledged to me he does not get that vanilla note in larger barrels. However, he says that the large barrels are more efficient cost-wise. So they use both new and old and blend the results together. So this is a different approach, but we see them making these decisions given how the barrel size is going to affect the spirit. Another factor is duration of aging. Now, the spirits in the world can age anywhere from days, a month to decades. We might casually think that more is better, but research has shown us that it's more important to have the correct length of aging rather than the greatest length of aging. And I read some very interesting articles. Recent research has been able to approximate the effects of barrel aging by something called wave mathematics, which I am in no way going to explain or present myself as an authority on. So I'll just say via wave mathematics, they have tried to replicate aging in a barrel. The research shows that basically all the effects of aging occur by 15 years. In fact, they say almost a third of the full effect happens in the first year, and almost a half of the effects happen in the second year. But each distiller has to decide what duration of aging is right for them and for their product. Here we have some thoughts from Brian Fatke, who is the owner and distiller of Prohibition Distillery in upstate New York. He has had several years under his belt at Prohibition Distillery, and he's learned about balancing these first two factors, barrel size and duration of aging. He says, I have learned a lot of lessons about oak maturation. One of these is that every barrel has a length of time versus volume that they can be aged. Great whiskey takes time. So it's very interesting that they're playing between these first two factors. But again, there are more. The last factor I'll mention is climate. Again, I'll acknowledging there are many more than these three that I brought up for today. How a spirit ages does depend on where it is being aged, its environment. Now, the environment you want for spirits is actually kind of the opposite of what you want for wine. In the wine world, you keep wine very stable, very temperate. You protect it like it's a very fragile thing. Barrel aging actually likes a bit of instability. Things like humidity and changing temperature play into barrel-aged spirits. So let me explain how changing temperature does benefit the spirit. When the temperature changes, there is expansion and contraction of the liquid itself. With heat, the liquor expands into the wood of the barrel. The liquid's actually capable of penetrating almost halfway through the barrel's edge, so quite a bit. Then, when the temperature cools off, the liquid retreats and brings with it all that good stuff from the barrel. And this dynamic is evident in this picture here. I'm in this picture here, and I'm with Matt Froman of Taconic Distillery, who we heard from a little earlier. What you're looking at here is their rick house, the place where barrels go to age. And it is actually a series of shipping containers in an open field. When I arrived there and Matt walked me to this field with these shipping containers, I thought it was crazy. But then Matt reminded me that the varying temperature and humidity of New York weather is actually promoting spirits maturation, promoting this expansion and contraction. These barrels and these shipping containers in this field are expanding and contracting every day, every week of each season, year round. And this very beneficial for the spirit. Now, the speed and intensity of all of this happening does vary very much region by region. Aging in hot and dry climates maximizes extraction. Think of rum in the Caribbean. Because rum producing climates are far more hot and humid, rum is generally aged for shorter periods of time. Now, you look at cooler places like Scotland, where you have more moisture and lower temperatures. Scotch whiskey can age for decades. So we look at all these factors that distillers have to balance, and these options that they're taking, and it's a real interesting game. Matt had this to say to me about the effort that a distiller takes in balancing all these factors. He said to me, in a barrel, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, which I love. So we've spoken about distillers and barrel aging as a general concept, but where is all of this barrel aging really going on, and for what types of spirits? Here we see the most common spirit categories in the world, and there are generally regulated barrel types and requirements you're seeing here, but let's also acknowledge there are many exceptions and different categories within all these categories. So these are just general estimations. But in looking at this, I notice a few things. First of all, I see that many different categories are using different oak species from around the world. I'm also seeing that different categories are aging for different durations, either because it's their option or because it's regulated in that area for that spirits category. The other thing I'm seeing really ties back into the title of this webinar, The Life of a Spirits Barrel. We see that some categories are using new barrels. Other categories are using used barrels. And for those used barrels, we know they must be coming from somewhere. So it means that all of those barrels are getting around the globe. So let's take a look at what happens when I do this. All right. So not only is a barrel born, not only does it have its first stint maturing spirits, but then it takes a ride elsewhere, and it might have a second and third and fourth stint maturing more spirits. I mean, so these barrels have a lot of passport stamps on them. We can follow, for example, the bourbon barrel. If we look at that, perhaps the bourbon barrel starts in Kentucky, and then it makes its way to Barbados to age rum, and then it maybe makes its way to Scotland to age scotch. Or perhaps it does go to Brooklyn for a barrel-aged gin. In the modern spirits industry, a spirits barrel will have a very long and varied resume these days. So now that we're starting to look at the modern spirits industry, I want to look at some other realities with barrel-aged spirits. All right, so just as it behooves us, oh, I see Christina saying that, and Christina, I think you're going to have a nice little surprise in a few slides. So just bear with me about those wine barrels, and you have a nice surprise coming. So let's look at the cost of barrels. Just as it behooves us to understand the impact of barrels on spirits, it's also important to understand the impact of barrels on the cost of production. Before I mention barrels, let's look at this list of to-dos here in barrel making. Barrel making is challenging. Remember, again, a barrel is magic. It has no nails. It has no glue. Try to build furniture like that. They're held together and ultimately sealed purely by the pressure of wood and some other parts. And to get there, you have multiple steps in the coopering process. from the harvesting of oak to charring the barrels to the moment when the staves are placed together, each of these steps involves a great deal of human skill and knowledge. So the question is, how much is all this? Now, I spoke with several distillers on this, and it is a sensitive topic to ask them about, but a lot of people were willing to give me clear and real information, in addition to what's posted out there on Cooper sites and otherwise. Um, they quoted me between $150 to $900 per barrel, and that does depend on the size of a barrel, the barrel type, and the cooperage that you're buying from. But they also pointed out to me that that cost does not end when you purchase the barrel. Cleaning the barrels and transporting the barrels costs money. Storing the barrels for the time that you are maturing the spirits costs money. I've seen so many distilleries that have to rent additional off-site storage facilities, and that costs money. Also, that angel share that we mentioned, the evaporative loss, is basically loss of money. So, all in all, each distiller I spoke with told me that using barrels is a major factor in their cost of operations. You could see by Brian's quote here that is true. And this, when he said this, shared this with me via email, it really made me laugh. Um, so, paying for barrels is a bit of a tough nut to swallow, but that's proof that we are all doing this because there are so many consumers who love barrel aged spirits. Um, and by the numbers, we really, really do love barrel aged spirits. So that leads me to the next modern issue we have, a barrel supply shortage. So in the past several years, supply had been a real problem. I'm sure so many of you had started seeing the headlines in some of the industry publications, and I was hearing distillers in my area casually mention it as well. So, what was causing this shortage? Well, two things were happening at the same time with very bad timing. First of all, we know that there has been a huge explosion of the spirits market. Just in the US alone, this trend of micro distilleries has started a renaissance. We've seen major increases in all category sales and record numbers in dollars in exports and imports. So that means that the demand for barrels, both domestically and internationally, is at record levels. At that very same time, the lumber industry contracted. When the US housing market crashed in 2007, 2008, a lot of sawmills shut down and loggers abandoned that market. Lumber production was enormously affected. The logging industry has started to rebound as the housing market has recovered, but the white oak supply has not caught up with demand yet from barrel makers. Remember, we saw earlier on the slide showing all the barrels moving all over the globe? Well, when you have an issue like this affecting barrel supply, it affects the entire global supply chain. Now, Coopers really felt this. And believe it or not, they were turning down business. Here are some thoughts from Richard Hobbs of the Barrel Mill. And he said an overwhelming demand for barrels over the past few years put us in the unfortunate situation of having to turn down business because we were at capacity. Now, I read about another place, McGinnis Wood Products in Missouri, and they've been in business for 50 years. And for the first time ever, they were getting offers above list price. Multiple distillers were offering to pay them $250 a barrel for $150 barrels in terms of list price. And it was the first time that that had ever happened. So these are interesting symptoms of what was going on here. Now, as Coopers were having to say no to businesses, not all distillers were suffering the same. Who suffered the worst? Mostly the new guys and the little guys. The larger established distilleries had long-standing relationships with their coopers. For the most part, their demand had been met. But for smaller operations, who are new to the game, barrel shortage has really been real. A lot of the distillers I spoke with discussed how they had to make real decisions over the years. Some of them actually postponed a particular product in their line. Um, Others had to adapt using different sizes that were less ideal, either smaller or larger than what they really wanted to be using. And in the worst case, a few of them literally had to distill less because there was no barrel on the other end waiting for them. There was nothing to do with that new make spirit once they were done with it. So that sounds dire, but the good news is that we're seeing solutions and growth again. That mill I mentioned in Minnesota, they purchased Stave Mill and they increased production threefold over the past few years. They also introduced some larger barrels to their lines to address certain needs. At Brown Forman Cooperage, which is, as many of us know, one of the largest businesses for this in the country, they made a similar decision for expansion. When their internal forecasts called for a 50% increase in barrel production, they invested in a new plant in Alabama. That new plant allowed them to increase production, and then it also halved the time required to truck a lot of barrels over to Tennessee to Jack Daniels, which they supply. So there's been a lot of solutions and a lot of growth. And all of the distillers that I've spoken to have said that these measures and the adjusting of all of this has, for the most part, changed the tides, and they see the end of this shortage, either here or coming close. Now, the good news is that, oops, sorry about that. I'm going to go back one slide. The good news is that the future of barrel aged spirits is really bright. Now, remember, I mentioned my favorite Dr. Seuss book. And this is the part of the webinar where I get to share with you the very cool places that barrels are going. The places you'll go, barrels are going there. We're in the midst of a barrel aging hysteria, and barrels are living more exciting and varied lives than ever. And I think it's great, and I find it very exciting. So let's look at a few of these things. Barrels these days are living 9 lives. The spirits world and also the food world are repurposing barrels and putting all sorts of unexpected things in them. At Tuttletown Spirits, their Hudson Maple Cask Rye is a great example. They first use barrels to age whiskey, and then they send those barrels to maple syrup makers who age their maple syrup in them. And then when the syrup is emptied, they send the barrels back to Tuttletown and they refill them. And they make this Manhattan maple cask rye whiskey. The product is seasonal, of course, and they tell me that it sells out every single year. Now, over at Taconic Distillery, they struck up a collaboration with a regional coffee roaster here in the area that I live called Coffee Labs. Now, it starts at the distillery. Taconic ages a rum in barrels, and then they send those rum barrels over to Coffee Labs. Coffee Labs puts roasted beans in the barrels, and then they sell those beans to their customers, and they run out of those beans all the time. Those barrels come back to Taconic, and Taconic is brainstorming what spirit they're going to age next in these coffee barrels. So you're seeing this movement and this boomerang happening where things are being filled and refilled to add flavor along the way. It's really fascinating. We're also seeing a lot of old ways, old methods in new places. And a great example of this is at Hill Rock Estate Distillery. Hill Rock is a great place. They're one of the few true field to glass whiskey producers in the world, working only with their estate grain. but they're also one of the first bourbons in the world to be aged in the Solera method. Now, some of you who cross between the spirits and the wine world are very familiar with the Solera method. We immediately think of sherry in Spain, where both sherry and the Solera method is a centuries old practice. A Solera system refers to a series of tiered barrels, which we see here, where you put the youngest spirit in the first barrel, and then incrementally over time, you do, a little bit to a little bit to a little bit till you get to the oldest barrel at the bottom. It's called running of the scales. Um, and at the end, you're basically uh, bottling a sort of a multi-vintage, multi-blend aged product. Um, Now at Hill Rock, they're doing this. They're bringing what's happening in Jerez, Spain, to upstate New York. They manually siphon small amounts of young spirit from barrels and they transfer it to older and older and old barrels. This is extraordinarily tedious. So it's really fascinating that this old practice that's associated with sherry and with the region of Jerez in Spain is now here in bourbon in America. It's really cool. Now, in some instances, distillers are just going to the extremes. Um, the Glenlivet 50-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey is a good example. It was freshly distilled back in 1964, and it spent half a century in the barrel. And that is a lot of time. So most of that initial alcohol had actually been evaporated. After all those decades, it left a mere 100 bottles available for sale. And they were sold. And they were sold at $25,000 a piece. So there you go. That's quite an interesting product there. Quite impressive. Now, Christina, you had mentioned wine barrels, and this is where you get your answer. And I hope you can get to a store and grab one of these sometime soon. So we saw this whole webinar, a lot of spirits barrels traveling around the world, but now we have wine barrels getting in on the action. It's very cool. Um, the Jefferson Reserve Groth cask starts as just a standard 6-year-old bourbon, but then it's finished for 9 months in barrels that previously held Cabernet Sauvignon from Groth vineyards in California. So that's pretty interesting. Imagine having a dinner party where you start with Groth Cab for dinner and then you have a nightcap finish. Pretty cool. So now maybe the wine thing and the bourbon thing kind of sounds normal to you, but we also see a mezcal here. Del Maguey makes these amazing single village and regional mezcals, and I suggest trying a few. They're great. This particular mezcal is a special product, and it was aged for 43 days in Cabernet Sauvignon barrels from Stag's Leap. So really unexpected to go from California Cabernet to Mexican mezcal. Really, really interesting. Now, some of the innovations allow you to cheat. Um, Remember we discussed angel share earlier, that amount of spirit that we lose through evaporation? Well, the Jim Beam Devil's Cut is basically stealing it back from the angel. Um, After aging, they sweat barrels. And what they get out of that is they're able to extract over 2 extra gallons of very intense whiskey that has been absorbed into the staves. They put this back into the full whiskey batch, and apparently it tastes great. I have not tried this yet, but it's winning competitions. So that's quite interesting. Now, the last product that I'll talk about before we finish up this webinar is cheating a lot more than angels share. This one is actually trying to cheat time in the barrel. Now, we heard earlier from one of the distillers that good spirits take time, but maybe not. This is very interesting. The Thea 1 reactor is a game changer. This Thea stands for Targeted Hyperesterification Aging. So let's say that 3 times fast. It's basically cheating time in the barrel. It's hacking barrel aging. What it does is we acknowledge that it takes spirits many, many, many years to break down wood. This reactor basically speeds up the decomposition of wood with light rays and other mechanisms. Um, and it can replicate 20 years of barrel aging in a matter of days. This company leases the reactor to other companies, particularly young companies that want to release a quote unquote aged spirit. And that's one that we have here from Rational Spirits, Santeria Rhyme. I personally have never tried anything that has been produced via this Thea 1 reactor method. I would be very curious to try it and maybe have a blind tasting, but it's pretty fascinating, and I think it's interesting future for barrels. So we're going to finish up now, but that Thea 1 reactor is a very far leap from the beginning of barrels aging spirits. When the earliest distillers learned that forests would have an influence on spirits, they likely could not imagine anything near to the way that we are using barrels today. I doubt they could. The life of a spirits barrel has become really exciting, and I frankly can't wait to see how much more exciting it's going to become in the future. So thank you guys, everybody, for listening. I would love it if people would maybe make some notes and recommendations of interesting barrel aged products in the chat room, some things they've tried, so we all could look at those and try those also. But thank you again. I'll turn it back over to Jane. And again, I hope you all have a nice barrel aged nightcap after this webinar. So Jane, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was fascinating and very much fun. Anyway, so you guys know that there's a handout available. Actually, you can get it right here off of the Adobe Connect website, or it's back on the Wine, Wit, and Wisdom blog post, the Wine, Wit, and Wisdom site, where you clicked over onto this. And all the slides are there, so if you like that, you can have that. And also remember that Elizabeth will be back with us on December 7th for the Emerging Wine Regions of the United States. And I'm actually going to be doing a webinar, a drink along, or shall I say taste along webinar on Valpolicella next Tuesday, which has actually been rescheduled from next Wednesday because a lot of people wanted to watch a certain little debate on TV, but we'll also be having, we'll be repeating that on a Saturday as well. So anyway, if you have any questions, comments, please send them to me. Again, thank you so much to Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us on your Wednesday evening, and have a great rest of the evening and a great rest of the week. Bye-bye, y'all.